Welcome to Full Momentum, an HEC-RAS podcast. I'm your host, Ben Carey, and here joining me, as always, Chris Goodell. Chris, it's been a while. This is episode 38, but it's been a number of months since we recorded episode 37, in which we talked a lot about gates. So what have you been up to the last couple of months?
Yeah, something about this consulting life, it makes you a little busy at times. But yeah, work has been super busy, and I think we've talked about this in the podcast before, but I'm building a house and getting really close to having that done. So that's occupying most of my spare time. And, every once in a while I try to make the most out of living in Corvallis and go to a few games here and there. Went to a baseball game last night, I told you about, and embarrassingly dropped a foul ball that was hit at me and lost it to somebody else, which was really sad. But yeah, it was a good game anyway.
Well, Chris, I will say, when it comes to RAS modeling, you never drop the ball. So.
Way to go, man. That's a good one.
But yeah, I'm excited to be back on here with you. We are going to try to get back into our monthly cadence that we had planned on at the beginning of the year. So we have some additional episodes lined up for the next couple months that we're really excited about. But today, we're going to talk about how to model the different options that we have of modeling large woody debris, engineered log jams, other sort of restoration type of features in HEC-RAS. This is a really interesting topic. It's one that when we teach this class to practitioners, this question always comes up about how you model these sort of complex obstructions. What are the different ways you can do it? What are the pros and cons of doing so? So we're going to get into that quite a bit today, and we have some cool visuals to show you and some different things to talk through. And hopefully at the end of this episode, everybody maybe doesn't have a clear path in terms of what you should do, but at least have a better understanding of, again, what are the pros and cons of choosing these different methods to represent large woody debris. So really excited to get into that. Before we do, though, Chris, I do want to just remind people about our next upcoming HEC-RAS 1D, 2D class that's currently open for registration. This is going to be through our Full Momentum Solutions LLC, and first day of class is on June 18th. It's going to run over the course of 7 weeks. Normally this is a 6-week class, but we're actually going to skip 1 week because we have another teaching obligation. So it's going to run over 7 weeks till July 30th. It's going to be our typical online class format where we lecture for 4 hours every Wednesday from 8 a.m. Pacific time to noon p.m. Pacific time. So that's 11 Eastern to 3 Eastern if you're on the East Coast. And yeah, it's going to be our standard class. So we're going to cover a lot of really interesting topics, whether it's 2D theory, 2D bridges. We're going to do some rain on grid discussions, as well as a rain on grid workshop that we debuted in our last online class that went really, really well. So a lot of cool topics that we're going to be covering in that, and encourage you that if you're interested in getting RAS 1D, 2D training, consider signing up for that. Again, June 18th to July 30th. Class is filling up fast, so if you're interested, make sure you register today, and you can do so at rastraining.com. We'll include the link to that in this video. Chris, anything to add to our upcoming class?
Classes are a lot of fun. Ben and I have a good time, and I think the attendees really enjoy the laid back atmosphere, the approachability of topics, and the discussions that come out during the Q&A sessions. And one thing I tell people a lot, and I bet you agree with me, Ben, but every time I teach this class, I learn something new. And so I really enjoy that aspect of it too, because the people who come in, who attend the classes, ask great questions and offer really good advice and options, and and teach us all things that Ben and I don't necessarily know yet. So yeah, it's a fun time, and there's a lot of learning to be had. So come join us.
Absolutely. Piggybacking off of that, in addition to our upcoming standard 1D, 2D HEC-RAS class that starts on June 18th, we also made an exciting announcement between the last time that we had one of these vodcasts and now, and that is the fact that we're launching um, a new two-part HEC-RAS training series that's going to be available to folks. We're going to start with our first part of that series, which is we're calling our fundamentals of HEC-RAS. And then that's going to lead directly into what we're labeling our advanced HEC-RAS 2D class. And so this table here that I'm sharing right now, for those that are interested, kind of does a good job of breaking down what the different topics are between those different classes. The fundamentals of HEC-RAS covers exactly what it sounds like, right? It's for those that maybe haven't used RAS before or very, very new to the software that want to learn not only about 2D, but about 1D modeling, and just need a little bit more time to get used to just working inside of the RAS engine, working inside a RAS mapper. So that's going to be a really, really great class for beginners. And then again, that's going to piggyback directly into a advanced HEC-RAS 2D curriculum, which is going to cover some of those building blocks that we cover in the fundamentals class, but then it's going to get into a lot more advanced topics. Some of these we briefly cover in our current class, but a lot of these we're going to be able to take to the next level, whether it's around troubleshooting and calibration, rain on grid modeling, some advanced RAS mapper features, even discussions around 2D floodway encroachment analysis. All of those are going to be covered in our advanced 2D RAS class.
Hmm.
In terms of dates, if you're interested in these classes, our first fundamentals of HEC-RAS class is going to be launching this fall. I believe the specific dates of that are in our online website. So it looks like we're starting that class on October 1st of this year, and that'll run through November 5th. And then our advanced 2D class is going to be starting in spring of 2026. And that's going to run from right now, March 4th to April 8th is where we have that class scheduled. So I know it's a ways out, but we want to give people a heads up, especially if they're interested in potentially taking both of those classes in series. I think that's a great way to get a really comprehensive amount of training within the HEC-RAS software.
By the way, that's a really sharp logo up there, Ben. I noticed.
Yeah.
Huh? It's looking nice.
Yeah, Chris and I recently
Uh,
did a little bit of rebranding on Full Momentum Solutions, and this is the result of that. So we're definitely proud of our new logo and our new branding, and we're excited to debut it in class in just a couple weeks from now. So again, if you're interested, sign up rastraining.com. That's going to be the place to find all this information. You can also reach out to Chris and I on LinkedIn or at info@rastraining.com, and we're happy to answer any questions that you may have.
yeah,
So with that, should we jump into some large woody debris conversation, Chris?
let's talk large woody debris. Yeah, I'm
Okay,
excited. This is great.
awesome. Before we do that, let me just give a quick shout out to the sponsor for today's episode. That's our firm, Kleinschmidt Associates, where Chris and I both work full time. Kleinschmidt Associates is known throughout the industry as a firm that provides practical solutions to complex problems affecting energy, water, and the environment. You can learn more at kleinschmidtgroup.com. And speaking of Kleinschmidt Group, our company LinkedIn page posted a question, I believe last week, that kind of was a leading question into today's episode, and that was, that there are multiple ways to represent large woody debris in an HEC-RAS 2D model, and we wanted to know that as users, what's your preferred method? We had a couple different options out there. The first is using elevated Manning's N values to represent these large woody debris placements within a river or stream. The second is to do large woody debris terrain modifications. There's a couple different ways to do that. We also have a new feature within RASMapper that's called porosity. And so that's a feature that we'll talk a little bit about today. It's still kind of at the leading edge of being able to use that for design and engineering purposes, but we'll talk about that option. And then the last option that was on that poll was just other, and what people, use maybe if we didn't think of an option. By far and away, Chris, the two most popular options here were using elevated Manning's end values and using large woody debris terrain modifications. About 90% of the audience use one of those two methods. So
When you say the large woody debris, are you talking about the actual tree stamps, or are you talking about raising the terrain up in a
yeah, so
block?
we didn't clarify in this poll question. So
Okay.
that could, but certainly we'll get into that in a few minutes here. But what are your initial reactions to the results of that poll?
But say, what was the percentage again? Was it
Yeah, so
evenly split?
about 53% of people used elevated Manning Z values, and then 36% of people use large woody debris terrain modifications, and then 10% kind of are split between the other two.
Others. Yeah. Yeah. I guess I'm not surprised. I mean, the end value thing is very convenient. It's easy to use. It does have its drawbacks, and we'll mention some of those coming up here. But it is easy and convenient, which is, I think, a very important component of it, and probably why more than half of the people are using that. The terrain mods, those have their pluses and minuses too. The one thing I don't like about terrain mods is they're solid objects, and I think that can cause some deficiencies in looking at some of the effects of putting in this large woody debris. So yeah, but not too surprising, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, and for those of you who maybe are tuning into this episode and don't do a lot of restoration modeling, you might be asking yourself, why is this even a topic? All of the physical features that we typically represent within HEC-RAS, they all have built-in ways to model that, right? Like if we were to post a question about how do you like to model 2D bridges, I would hope that 100% of people would say using 2D bridges, right? How do you like to model a dam? Well, we have inline structures for 1D models, and we have SA2D area connections for 2D models. But with
Hmm.
these sort of kind of softer, more nuanced applications like large woody debris, engineered log jams, there's not a clean, clear way to do so. And that's why people have kind of come up with different ways to try to represent these the best they can. But each of them certainly have drawbacks and limitations. So that's kind of
Yeah.
why the topic today is of one of interest for many people that do this type of modeling.
Yeah, and the thing is, it's a very popular thing here in the Northwest where Ben and I live, to put wood structure, wood features in rivers, to try and mimic nature a little bit more, maybe even add some stabilization to banks. But really, it's mostly a habitat thing. And so some of you who maybe have never heard of large woody debris or engineered log jams, what are we talking about? It's just simply putting in a matrix of logs, large branches, anchoring it in place so that it doesn't wash away during a big flood event. And what that does is it tries to mimic kind of the natural processes of rivers, where you get wood that will eventually fall in or travel down into a river and lodge up somewhere and then collect other debris. And fish tend to like that stuff. It provides good shelter for them, a place to hide, but also shading um, from the heat during the day. And so it's really good habitat. The challenge though is, for us as hydraulic modelers, is how do we model a structure like that? Because you can imagine if you just put like a big jam of wood, there you go. So there's some bank stabilization right there with some logs in there. Um, you could find I don't know if there's a picture of an engineered log jam. That's kind of a different feature for a
Mhm.
slightly different purpose, but that would be a good one to show too. But the bottom line is these features are largely three-dimensional. The hydraulics around those features. There's one right in the top middle there, Ben.
Mhm.
It's in the dry though. Yeah, right there. So there's a good example of a large wood jam. You can see they're building it right there in that photo. Um, oh, I know some of those people.
There's
Yeah,
the
great photos there. Yeah, there's a good one right there, that shows the construction of a large wood jam. Well, we want to make sure that number one, it stays in place, but number two, it's providing good habitat, and not just qualitatively, but quantitatively. Are we hitting the velocities that we want? Do we have, too much head drop through it? What are the fish going to be experiencing around that? So keeping it in place and making it good for fish are the things that you want to check out in your HEC-RAS model. But as you can imagine, something like this is very three-dimensional, right? I
Yeah.
mean, you got water moving in all directions through this thing, but we're limited to two-dimensional in HEC-RAS. And so we got to try and make do with the tools available to us. And that's what we're going to get into today.
Yeah. Yeah, and in addition to, potentially looking at the hydraulic impacts on fish and some of our other kind of softer goals within our engineering design, we also have potentially some hard caps that we have to stay under, such as, adding a lot of roughness to a river channel like this can actually cause a rise in water surface elevation. Depending on where you are at in the country, you might not be allowed to cause a rise to a
Yeah.
base flood or a 100-year water surface elevation. So we're also going to want to look at what the impacts are to surrounding infrastructure, and other, adjacent properties and whatnot. So there's a lot of angles to this, and we're going to try to briefly touch on some of those in this discussion. So we thought the best way to kind of facilitate this conversation was to actually build out a few different models, each of which that represents this sort of large woody debris engineered log jam, with a different mechanism, and then compare some results and talk about why we're seeing what we're seeing, and some of the other limitations that come along with modeling each of these. So I have a RAS model here. This is the RAS model that we actually use in our standard 1D 2D class for our river restoration workshop. And I've created a number of different geometries and model plan files, each of which that represent an engineered log jam, which we're placing here and here with different types of features. Now, the reason why we're looking at two separate engineered log jams is not just because we wanted to create more work for ourselves, even though that's exactly what happened, but also because the differences that you'll see between these different ways to represent large woody debris or engineered log jams um, depend a lot on the level of velocity that's coming into and moving through the features. If you have a relatively slow moving backwater area, you're probably not going to see much difference at all between these different methods. As you move these features out into higher velocity areas, or if your project sees higher velocities during a higher flood event, these differences will show themselves a little bit more, and it becomes more important to
Mhm.
understand the differences between them. So
Yeah.
let's start our conversation, Chris, around kind of this more backwater oxbow restoration site. So the three different ways that I chose to represent this in RAS. Again, this is a fully 2D RAS model. I'll go ahead and turn on my geometry just so everybody can see exactly what our 2D area looks like. You can see I used a refinement region of 1 meter around this restoration site. I think we're using something like 10-meter cells outside of it. So anytime you're doing restoration modeling, especially if you're comparing different results between different methods, it's really important to make sure you have enough cell resolution around that to realistically compare and represent those features. So that's why I'm using this refinement region. I'm using the same level of refinement for all of these examples. The first way that I represented this large woody debris or engineered logjam is just by using an elevated Manning's N value. So all I did is come in here, I added a calibration region around this polygon, and I think I assigned a Manning's N value of 10. That's very, very high, right? That's basically going to slow water down to almost zero velocity, but it's going to kind of capture how this sort of energy dissipating type of design is really going to deflect flow, slow down velocities. So that's a very common way to represent this. The second way is I went ahead and made a terrain modification, and I just increased the elevation of this whole large woody debris up to, I think, 3 or 4 meters above the bottom of the channel here. So this is what that looks like when you add that in. You can see my uh, elevation of my terrain is around 283 meters around the engineered logjam, and then it's 287 in this little terrain modification. So this is going to do something similar, right? It's going to deflect our flow. It's going to not allow flow to enter into this area, but it's definitely going to produce slightly different results, especially visually, when we compare that to our Manning's End, elevated Manning's End approach. The third option that I modeled here was to uh, take this engineered logjam and represent it with actual large woody debris terrain modifications. So if you come in here to our terrain layer, one of our modification types that we have the ability to add is it's called large woody debris. And you can see this is just kind of a mishmash of different trunk sizes and root sizes. And again, this isn't an accurate engineering design that you'd want to incorporate into Civil 3D or something like that, but it does give us kind of a quick and dirty way to account for what an engineered logjam might look like.
Yeah, and each of those T's basically in there represent a single tree. And in the large woody debris terrain mod, you put each one in individually, but no reason why you can't stack them on top of each other
That's
like
exactly
that.
right. So this is what that large woody debris editor looks like. So you give it a name, you give it a bottom elevation, you can rotate the angle in here or manually. You can change the diameter of the root wad or the length of that, as well as the diameter and length of the trunk. So got some customization that you can incorporate there, but
Mhm.
it's definitely not perfect.
The other thing I think that's important to point out about this feature too is that water does not go under these tree trunks,
Yeah.
even though in reality, when you start stacking trees together like this into a big uh, log jam, you're gonna have water moving over and above the tree trunks and the root wads and everything. There's gonna be a lot of open space below, but this is just a limitation in RAS. When you stamp in a terrain mod, it goes all the way into the existing terrain. No
Yep.
spaces or gaps underneath it.
Yeah, and we'll be able to look at some of the results and you'll kind of point out some of the limitations that you have whenever you're doing something like this.
Yeah.
Um, the fourth and final way that I represented this engineered logjam is with kind of like a beaver dam analog approach, where you're putting a bunch of circular piers representing kind of the additional loss that you can get through a design like this. So this is what the terrain modification looks like for these. You can see just a bunch of piers, again, that are all, we go here, about, somewhere between 2 and 3 meters above the elevation of our channel bottom. And you can see these are scattered kind of throughout this. If we look at what our 2D area looks like, underneath there, you can see that our cells are capturing these elements for the most part. There's a couple that aren't perfectly aligned, but this is doing a pretty good job of representing what the loss associated with the energy loss associated with water moving through something like this might be. One of the limitations within RAS 2D, in theory, you would want an infinitely small cell to represent this engineered logjam, but you'd end up with thousands and thousands of cells, and that can really slow down your model. So this is where you kind of have to make a compromise between using cells that are small enough to capture some of the detail, but still large enough to be able to run in a practical setting. So
What I really like about this one, Ben, is that here in this setup, as opposed to the trees that you showed before, the tree stamps, you can have water moving in and around these piles, right? So
mhm.
but with the tree stamps, it's effectively just blocking off the whole flow area, right? And
Yeah,
you can
yeah,
have water go over the top, and you can have water fill in those gaps in the middle, but they're effectively just blocking everything. Whereas these vertical piles allow water to kind of snake in and around the individual piles and work its way through it a little bit, maybe more realistically, or at least similar to what a log jam would actually do. Now, the obvious downside to this is that all of these piles are vertical up and down, which in the picture you showed before, there were a few of them that were up and down vertically, but a lot of them are, laying down sideways or kind of diagonal and in all different orientations.
yeah. And I
So,
realized I was actually showing the wrong mesh there. So this is the 1 meter mesh with the, again, kind of single terrain modification, the engineered log jams, and then the pier. So we're actually getting a little
yeah,
bit more detail
yeah,
in this case, which is good. But yeah, Chris,
yeah.
that's a great point in terms of the differences between these. I like to think of these as this is like the simplest and dumbest way to represent an
Hmm.
engineered log jam with terrain modifications. This would be kind of a little bit more complex. You're having a little bit of storage that's offered in there, but it's still going to basically create a completely ineffective flow area behind some of these engineered log jams. And this is going to be your most refined way to do this with terrain modifications. The downside, again, with this is you have to have really small cells. So if you have
Yeah,
a large model that has quite a few of these, you could be looking at hours and hours of runtime, and that might not be feasible. So you got to kind of weigh those different options.
that's right.
So
Small
what's your
cells equals small time steps
that's right. What's
equals
your
long run times.
what's your
Yeah.
initial gut reaction, Chris, to seeing these four? I know. Do you have one that you um, typically use? What's most interesting to you?
Yeah, well, the end value one I like because it's easy to do. And I mean, it's just you simply draw your calibration region, right?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
give it a higher end value. And that's at a minimum what you have to do. I mean, you probably want to have some smaller cells, but you don't have to like you do with these terrain mods, especially with the pier piles that we were showing there. However, I don't like the some of the results you get with elevated end values, and we'll show you that here in a second. Um, for that reason, I'm drawn more towards the pier piles, the fourth option you showed there with all the circles. I
Hmm.
know that it's not a perfect representation of the logjam that you have, but if you can come up with an approximate, porosity or volume of voids within the design log jam and try to at least replicate that volume of voids inside this polygon here with your pier piles, I think you're going to do a pretty good job of getting the information out that you need to for design. Again, the next step beyond this would be 3D modeling in my mind.
Yeah.
And so we don't, this is not a Flow 3D podcast, so we're not going to get into that.
Maybe on an episode coming up here shortly, we'll be able to get into that a little bit more.
I would
But
love
yeah,
to see a 3D, model of a large wood jam. That would be pretty cool to see.
no doubt, no doubt. All right, let's take a look at some of the results. So what I have here is our first simulation, which was using an elevated Manning's N value to represent that large woody debris. You can see the flow as it's kind of bending around that engineered log jam on both sides, most of the flow going to the left. And if we compare this to, let's actually look at the baseline because that's a good kind of way to evaluate what sort of an impact this has. So this is the existing condition without any sort of stream barb in place. You can see what that looks like. And then again, we look at the large woody debris um, represented with an elevated Manning's M value, and looks pretty good. I don't have any real concerns, just with, at least with the velocity uh, display. It looks like it's doing its
Well,
job.
it's doing what you think it should do. You got
Yeah,
that real slow velocity. It's deflecting around the wood structure, even creating a little eddy pattern at the downstream end of it.
yeah, yeah. So that looks pretty good. Let's turn on the example where we used the terrain data, the elevated terrain data set. So you can see that when we turn on the right terrain, so we can compare apples to apples. Turn on simple terrain mod here. So then this is with that just single elevated terrain, completely blocking that out. And what you'll notice is if we kind of toggle back and forth between the elevated Manning's plan and the elevated terrain data, there really is very little difference around the engineered logjam. Where we mostly see it is inside, right? Because with the elevated Manning's value, we're still able to get water inside of there, it still provides storage. It's just not moving very fast. Versus this terrain modification, there's not any water that's getting inside of there. Overall, it looks very, very similar between these two. And like
Now,
Chris
did
said,
the,
go ahead.
yeah, I was going to say they look shockingly similar. Is it actually updating the velocity map? Like if you go down and turn that one off and then click on that one. Yeah. Okay. Well,
Yep, it is.
yeah. Oh, okay.
Yeah, so super similar results. But again, we're looking at a kind of a more backwater condition, right? Where we have lower
Hmm.
velocities. If we look
That's right.
here, velocities are only around a couple tenths of a meter per second. So not super fast. Would expect these results to be somewhat
Yeah.
similar.
Well, and you did use an N value of 10, which is effectively turning all the water into zero velocity, through there.
Yep,
So,
yep,
I mean,
agreed.
hydraulically, yeah, you're creating the exact same thing.
Yep,
One just is a physical solid object versus the other is just a pond of water that's not moving in the middle of
yep.
your domain. Yeah.
And then here's the large woody debris with the engineered log jams. Again, you can see some of the interstitial space inside of the log jams have water now,
Mhm.
but again, we compare these two plans, they look very similar overall in terms of the velocity distribution.
Yeah.
Very little difference. A little bit of shifting, but for the most part, those look similar. And then lastly, let's look at the piles here. So again, if I turn off the engineered log jam, turn on my pile geometry, then turn on the results here. Now here we'll see a little bit of difference, right? This
Hmm.
is the real benefit, right, of this approach is you're actually able to get some velocity inside of, in between these different terrain modifications. If we look at the bigger picture in terms of velocity, probably not going to see a whole lot of difference there between, let's say, our elevated Manning's N simulation, which is shown here. So not a lot of difference around the restoration feature itself, but certainly inside of it, you can see that there's quite a bit more detail.
Yeah. To me,
So
this is exactly what I picture the velocities doing inside of a real log jam. You kind of
right,
have little pockets of high velocity in and around where water's able to move, but a lot of dead space in there too. A lot of shadowing, a lot of probably if you were to use smaller cells, you'd see a lot of eddies inside of there.
yep,
What if you zoom in? I'm curious what that looks like. Nice and zoomed
sure.
in.
So one thing I will caveat with Chris talking through this that's super important is like with any hydraulic modeling, it may look better. That doesn't mean it is better. So anytime you're doing restoration design in particular, it's going to be really important to try to get some calibration data to kind of nail down some of the uncertainties regarding how you're representing these. Because again, just because it looks better doesn't mean it is better. You're going to want some sort of verification data. So that goes
That's
for
right.
any sort of way you represent restoration features.
Yeah, it's cool to see all these little wake patterns behind all the cylinders because that's kind of what you would expect to see. Can you, like in contrast, can you bring up the stamped trees and turn on particle tracing for that?
Sure. Yeah.
Be interesting to see what that looks like.
Yeah. So that's going to be this one. I'll turn on the correct terrain data so you can see what's
And
underneath
by the
there.
way, while Ben's doing this, I think we should all appreciate how difficult it is to do this on the fly when you're presenting.
Yeah.
Trying to make sure you get all the right layers selected on the left. So good job, Ben.
Yeah. So you can see, yeah, we're not getting quite as much through velocity, but you're still getting some
Right.
cool eddies in some of these
Yeah.
little areas.
Yeah.
So,
And maybe this is if you're interested on what's happening around the perimeter, maybe this is
yeah.
a good tool for that. But yeah, certainly in the middle, especially that very middle kind of
Hmm.
shape right there. Yeah. There's no velocity there at all. It's just ponded water.
Yeah.
And that's because these tree features block all the way down to the existing terrain. There's nothing going underneath them.
Yeah, exactly. And then you compare that to this, right? This is our terrain feature, so we're not seeing anything exciting inside of
Yeah.
this. We're getting some eddies on the downstream side, and then lastly, again, I'll just turn on Manning's N for kicks, so we can see what that looks like. Again, just very slow moving water, not a lot of
Yeah.
hydraulic complexity.
The cool thing
Um,
about the N value option too is that there's subjectivity with what N value to use. And if you want to show a little bit more velocity through there, well, you use a lower N value. Instead of 10, maybe use 3. Instead of 3, maybe use 1. Those are all very high N values compared to what you would normally use in a flood model. but they do a good job of basically reducing conveyance to whatever your desire is.
Yeah.
And it's an easy change to make too.
Now, the last option that we didn't actually model today, but I wanted to bring up is that the porosity flow drag layer that you can now create within RAS Mapper. That's added in as a map layer, and you basically just define what your classification polygons are. So if I open this up and edit the different, you can see here, I actually tried this out where I tried to give, thickness, porosity, linear, and quadratic drag coefficients to our engineered logjam um, polygon. What I ran into is you actually have to define what these parameters are for your whole model extent. If there's any cells that don't have these components, the model won't run.
Mm,
And so I was guessing on what these were going to be, let alone what they would be in an open channel flow situation. So
yeah,
it seems to me like this is very much um, kind of a work in progress in terms of potentially be able to use it for restoration design now. But I like
yeah,
the idea of having something that's a little bit more coefficient based that can potentially be fleshed out and maybe even some studies and papers published on it, as opposed to us just trying to like rough in, pile sizing and orientation and blockage. It'd be nice to have some more numerical backing behind that.
yeah. I really appreciate that this feature's in, but I agree with you. I think it needs maybe not work on HEC's part, but maybe just research done on, hey,
Mhm.
what, how do we use this with large wood jams? But I think it has promise to be probably my favorite one of all of these. If we can figure out what are some reasonable values to use for those parameters that you were just showing, because
Yeah.
this one would be really easy to implement too. It's just a map layer, just like an n value layer. It's just another map layer where you draw your porosity polygons wherever you'd like them, and then off you go. And pretty easy. Plus, I think very representative of what a log jam actually is.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
nothing in here is perfect. You got to get to a 3D model to get closer to perfect, but these are all really good methods.
Yeah, and I think it produces similar visual results, I think, to what an elevated Manning's N value would be,
Yep.
just in terms of slowing things down, visually seeing that you're not going to get a lot of interstitial complexity, but
Right.
it makes more sense. And again, it's going to be a lot easier to calibrate something like that where you're making fine-tune adjustments, as opposed to if you're trying to calibrate with these piles, you're having to change the
Mhm.
size and the orientation and
Yeah.
the number. Like that's just a lot
Cumbersome.
of work. It's nicer to just
Yeah.
quickly be able to adjust those values. And the other benefit of a porosity layer that we don't have when we're talking about Manning's N is some of the shortcomings when it comes to shear stress output. We're going to talk about that
Yeah.
in just a second here. So let's actually compare some of these results, not just visually, but actually with um, uh, some water surface elevations, some velocities, and some shear stresses. So I've drawn a profile line through the center of this restoration layer. And let's start with water surface because that's the easiest. So I'm going to right click and show our water surface elevations between these four different plans. And if we zoom in, what you're going to see here, if it's going to let me zoom in, there we go. Try this again. So what you're going to see here, again, our restoration feature somewhere in here. This is upstream of the restoration feature. This is downstream of the restoration feature. If we look at the y-axis here, we can see that all our water surface elevations are well within 100th of a meter. So we're definitely not seeing much change at all between these different
Mhm.
approaches. So if you're talking about floodplain management, achieving a no rise certification, doing a conditional letter of map revision where you're potentially adjusting the base flood elevations, if you're in a backwater oxbow low velocity area of your river or stream, probably is not going to make a huge difference from a water surface elevation standpoint, which of these methods you use.
Yeah.
Now let's look at velocity, see what the differences are there. Here you're going to see again upstream, we got a little bit of a difference. Again, we're all within a couple hundredths of a meter per second with velocity. As we get inside of our engineered logjam, everything goes to zero except for our piles scenario, because you can see again some of that interstitial velocity show up where don't have any velocity under some of the other plans. So that's going to be one of your benefits of using that sort of approach. And then on the downstream side, again, all pretty close. Looks like one of those plans, the pile plan, has maybe a slightly lower downstream velocity, but we're still within a few hundredths of a meter per second. So I don't see a big difference in terms of water surface and velocity in these backwater areas. Now let's look at
Hmm.
one thing that we do notice a big difference on, and that's going to be shear stress. Um, so I plot all four shear stresses. And it looks like the value of this is in pascals. It's been a while since I've used that unit or seen that unit.
Newtons per
Um,
meter square, right?
there you go. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so all of the shear stresses for the three plans not named Mannings, all are very, very low. And then for Mannings, we end up with this super, super, super high shear stress moving through or into that engineered logjam. And this is a common occurrence whenever you're using exaggerated or elevated Mannings M values to account for some of the physical loss that's associated with form of the river, whether that's an engineered logjam, a bridge, any other more physical or structural constraint that the water's seeing. Again, it's common to use an elevated Manning's M value to help capture that effect, but elevated shear stresses are a result of doing so. And Chris, you and I were having a good conversation about this earlier today. So do you want to share with
Yeah.
folks kind of what the math behind this is?
Yeah, so you can find this in the hydraulic reference manual for HEC-RAS. But one of or probably the biggest problem with plotting shear stress when you're using elevated N values is the equation that's used here. And you can see the equation that is used, and this is what's mapped when you do shear stress. This is density of water, drag coefficient, that's C sub D, and then you've got your velocity squared. The absolute value brackets here is just to preserve directionality in your velocity, right? That way, if we have a negative velocity, we can get a negative shear stress, right? Um, Now that's fine, but look at what the drag coefficient equation is. It's a function of n squared, Manning's n squared. Then you've got your gravitational constant there, and you've got hydraulic radius. But look at the n squared. So now if you're using an elevated n value, you're lumping in other things into your n value besides just the bed material itself. Squaring that is problematic. And then, Ben you had mentioned earlier that you're using an n value of 10, right? To simulate basically
Yep.
no conveyance through there. Now you've got 10 squared, 100 in this equation right here, and you multiply that by v squared, and you get these really, really large shear stress values. So this really only works if you're using conventional n values down in the range of 0.02 to, 0.05 or 6 or something like that. Any of those n values with a 0.0 in front of it, right? That's going to work well here. But once you get larger than that, these shear stress values tend to blow up. And that's the biggest problem I have with using n values for large woody debris, because shear stress is an important parameter to look at. It's used in the design. It's used to gauge, what forces are being applied to that wood debris, so we can make sure we design it to stay in place.
Mhm.
Um, and it's problematic if your shear stress values are wrong here. So
Yep. Yeah, so I think the takeaway here is, again, using an elevated Manning's M value to represent these sort of features is fine as long as the focus of your study is, more velocity, general velocity, water surface elevation impacts, general flow behavior. But as soon as you get into engineering design and stability, if you're going to be using shear stress output at all, it's not going to be a great a way to do that. You're going to want to use something else that it doesn't result in these kind of elevated shear stresses that are unrealistically high.
yeah,
All right, so with that backwater discussion kind of behind us, let's look at what the differences are, or if there are any differences between when we do this in more of the main channel where our velocities are quite a bit higher. Um, and so I'll go ahead and share my screen here while this is loading. Perfect. All right, so you can see what I did is I again added the same kind of engineered logjam location, but instead of in the backwater oxbow area, we did it kind of more in the main channel where the velocities are quite a bit higher. Just to see again if some of the conclusions that we drew from our backwater engineered logjam can be applied for the main river channel. So I did the same kind of method as I had done before. We used an elevated Manning's value. We used a single elevated terrain data set that looked like this. We used our engineered log jams that looked like that. And then we used our piles. Again, very, very similar orientation, just put inside of the main channel. When I ran those four, the results that we got, hopefully this will let me turn this on again, close out these layers. Again, like Chris said, it's always fun to kind of
Do it on the fly.
fight
Yeah.
HEC as we're doing it on the fly. Unfortunately, there is no quick way to turn these things on, as everybody will know, especially with how many different layers we have associated with this. So,
There we go.
there we go. All right. So once again, let's start with our Manning's value. That's going to be our baseline. And actually, before we get into the alternatives, let's look again at our existing conditions. So this would be without any of our restoration features turned on, and what the velocity of that looks like. There we go. So that's our existing condition. And then we add in this elevated Manning's M value, and all of a sudden we get results that look a lot different down here, right? So we're getting some real reduction in velocity through that, and then kind of the displacement of water on both sides of this engineered logjam. Might not be the best place to put this, probably going to cause some bank erosion here, but that's not the
Right.
purpose of today's discussion. If we compare, again, our elevated Manning's value to the situation where we have an elevated terrain data set. I'll toggle back and forth between those. There we go. So again, if we have Manning's, elevated Manning's here, compared to our terrain data, it looked very, very similar, like we saw in the upstream or in the backwater area. So the conclusion here is not a lot of, at least flow pattern difference between using elevated Manning's and an single elevated terrain feature. Now, if instead we replace this single terrain feature with our engineered log jams, I think we will see some pretty significant differences. So yeah, we start seeing,
Oh, yeah. Look
especially on
at
that
that.
downstream side, end up with some pretty interesting looking results.
That's interesting. What do the velocity patterns look like there? I'm curious what that little kind of.
Yeah, overall the velocity is pretty low in here still. So, but yeah, let's look at what that looks like. So yeah, it's just kind of two
Oh, it's a
eddies.
double. It's a double eddy.
Yeah,
That's why you have that high spot in the middle there.
yeah, yeah. That's pretty
Yeah,
cool.
interesting.
You don't see double eddies every
Not
day.
too often.
Like like Chris mentioned, you're not seeing any velocity or water actually move through this, right? So it is acting very much like a blockage. You got a little bit of storage in here, but not super efficient. Uh, and then lastly let's go ahead and turn off this and look at our piles alternative. So that's what our piles looks like compared to our engineered log jam. So
Mm,
getting a lot more velocity through there.
yeah.
Smaller ineffective area downstream. So there's actually a decent amount of flow that's being conveyed through this. If we turn on our particle tracing here, be able to see that, I think, a little bit more clearly. Still getting an eddy downstream, but definitely
Yeah. Less
more water
pronounced.
moving through, less pronounced.
That looks an awful lot like a like vortex shedding, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And you know, kind of a fun fact here, if you had just the right Reynolds number in the stream there, you would see an oscillating pattern, almost like a fishtail flapping
Mm-hmm.
back and forth, um, kind of pattern with that with the eddy behind it. It's called
Yeah.
vortex shedding.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and maybe in another episode, I can bring up my Von Karman vortex street model, which is pretty cool, and show
That's
you that
awesome.
you can actually simulate that in HEC-RAS.
Yeah,
Gotta
we've
have the
seen
right
that.
Reynolds numbers.
We saw that on a model we did in Alaska with really small
Yeah,
cells. So
yep, I remember that one.
but yeah, you can see, at least from a visual standpoint, quite a bit more difference, right? When we're looking at an elevated Manning's End for this restoration feature versus something like porosity, we're really seeing some change of the distribution of flow, as well as what those peak velocities actually end up being. So, as the conclusion here is, as you move out into a more the main portion of the river or the stream, velocities are higher. It is kind of potentially going to change your results a little bit more, at least visually, between these different methods. Last thing I'll do is I'll turn on a profile line that I drew again through all of these, and we can compare those same parameters that we were comparing previously, be it water surface elevation, velocity, and then shear stress. So let's go ahead and turn that on and compare what this looks like. All right, so again, this is upstream of our restoration feature. This is kind of through it, and then this is at the downstream end. Downstream end, not as much of a change. Looks like we're having a little bit. The engineered logjam ends up with the lowest velocity at the downstream end. We saw that probably with that double eddy, really slowing things down there, but all within, a few hundredths of a meter per second. At the upstream end, we definitely notice a little bit more of a difference. So the piles, alternative where we are representing that engineered logjam with piles, you see the lowest water surface elevation there. That correlates to a higher velocity as water is moving through those piles as opposed to being completely obstructed. And then all the other three options are all again within a few hundredths of a meter, getting a little bit more of a stratification. It looks like the engineered logjam again ends up with the highest water surface elevation correlating to the lowest velocity. So any takeaways, Chris, from at least the velocity distribution between these different methods?
Kind of what I would expect. You know, it's the results are a little bit magnified when you got higher velocities, and the differences are
Hmm.
magnified, I should say. What's interesting to
Hmm.
me, though, when you look at this, notice the swell head at the leading edge of the large wood structure, where the water surface
Yeah.
actually rises a little bit towards the energy grade line. You don't see the energy grade line plotted here, but this is the exact same thing that happens in front of a bridge pier, especially a big
Hmm.
bridge pier. You see the water as it approaches the pier, it slows down and it actually goes up in elevation slightly,
Hmm.
moving towards the energy grade line. And then as it splits to go around, you get that sharp drop. Now here it's obviously not this sharp in reality because we've got the Y scale exaggerated a little bit, but you do get this kind of sharp drop around the sides, and then you get that eddy pattern on the backside.
Yeah.
So this is like basically what you would expect around a bridge pier too, only it's a little maybe a little more rough the way
Now,
we put it in the model.
people might take that and ask the natural fault question, which is that seems like a 3D effect. How are we able to capture that within a 2D model?
Yeah, well, that is a really good question because what we are not capturing in a 2D model like HEC-RAS are vertical accelerations. Now, you
Hmm.
can see a change in water level as you move around spatially that shows a drop in water surface elevation, but there is no velocity component that is calculated in the z direction or the vertical direction. You only have x and y velocities calculated in a 2D model. So this could be an area where RAS is a little bit deficient, especially
Hmm.
if you have considerable vertical velocity components. You know, another place where 2D models don't work so well are on spillways because vertical velocity components, vertical acceleration is not only very important, but in a lot of cases dominant in the results. And we just don't have that. So
Yeah. The next one I've plotted up here is velocity, and you can see that there definitely are some big differences here. A couple tenths of a meter per second, that's getting up close to a foot per second on the upstream side, and then on the downstream side, we get very different results, um,
Hmm.
depending on which method we're using. And again, this just all has to do with how we're blocking that flow, whether we're completely blocking it. Um, and so again, if you are in particular like concerned with what the velocities are at the downstream end of this potential restoration site, like maybe you're concerned about erosion along this bank downstream of this, or there's some sort of boat ramp or something that extends out. You're going to want to do some testing and figure out what the best method might be, because as we can see, the velocities can be quite a bit different on the downstream end of these. Uh, and then the last thing I'll plot is the shear stress moving through here. Again, not a surprise. We have our elevated Manny's end values showing very high shear stresses as a result of that mathematical effect that Chris shared earlier. If we turn off um, that elevated Manning's plan, so we're just seeing the other ones, we'll get a little bit more realistic distribution of shear stresses. Again, they're all pretty close. You can see that the piles representation has the highest shear stress. That's correlating to the highest velocity. And on the downstream side, quite a bit of difference depending on what the velocity pattern looks like. So anyway,
Yeah.
I think that's a pretty in-depth conversation, at least to start. We're really excited about talking about this today, partially because Chris and I are by no means experts in this area. We know how to model these types of things, but we don't necessarily know the best way or whether there's other ways. What the literature says, what current people are using out that are doing a lot of restoration design, which Chris and I don't do a lot of. And so we're really interested in hearing from everybody who's listening to this video, whether it's on YouTube or on LinkedIn. If you have a preferred method, or if you maybe have a publishment that you refer to that Chris and I haven't heard of, please share that. We'd love to this video to turn into a crowdsource for folks that are interested in learning about the best way to do this.
Yeah, Ben and I aren't designers of these things, but we like to pride ourselves on being able to find creative solutions to model these kinds of things. And so, yeah, I'd love to hear from the restoration designers out there who do this stuff, and on a day-to-day basis, and what do they think about these different features, these different ways of modeling it at HEC-RAS, and are they useful? Are they going to be something you can use? Maybe it's a combination of a couple of these, what you ultimately do to get the information out of the model that you want. Because after all, the model is just something that's helping us answer questions. That's what we use it for. And to the extent that you can do that in your design work and feel comfortable about that, that's a good thing.
Yeah, I like your idea, Chris, of potentially maybe using a combination of these, right? And maybe taking
Yeah,
the more conservative of them for a particular design parameter that you're working with, and then maybe taking the other most conservative solution on the other side.
there you go.
But again, we're interested in hearing more about what you folks think, and yeah, this has been really fun. Chris, anything to add here before we close up shop for today?
Yeah, I can't wait to, get a little bit more for the porosity elements, because I think that'll be a really good one to add to the mix here when it's kind of ready for prime time. And there could be some practitioners out there, some restoration designers who are already using it, and we'd love to hear that from you as well. Like, how are you using it? What kind of parameters are you finding are good to use for those what were they, drag coefficients, and
Yeah.
a few others. But yeah, let us know about that. But I'm looking forward to, hopefully not in the distant future, where we can use porosity elements or porosity polygons, I guess, for lack of a better word, as maybe the preferred method for this.
Yep. Good. Well, that was a lot of fun. Thanks, Chris, for hopping on and chatting about that with me. Just a reminder for folks, our summer 2025 HEC-RAS 1D 2D class registration is now open. This class is going to get going in just a little over exactly 5 weeks from today. I guess it's going to be published a few days from now. So we're going to start class on June 18th. So again, if you're interested in learning about how to use HEC-RAS 2D in combination with 1D models, which is a really powerful thing. Um, This is a class Chris and I have been teaching for 5 years. We've gotten a lot of really good feedback from it. So if you're interested, definitely sign up today. And then also a last reminder on our fundamentals and advanced classes that are now open for registration as well. The fundamentals class will be this fall, and then our first advanced class will be next spring. And we're really, really excited to kind of take this all to the next level, hopefully with some of you.
Yeah. Yeah, it'll be fun. Tell us what you think about our new logo too. Only if it's good stuff though, because it's kind of like it's set in stone now. So
Yeah, it's
no
kind of like when
changing
you
it now.
it's kind of like when you tell people what your kid's name is. Like that's the
Yeah,
time to critique the name has already passed. So
that's right. Yeah. Window has closed on that one. But yeah, we like it. We're excited about the new branding, and so you'll be seeing more of that um, in the future.
awesome.
Cool. Thanks for setting that up, Ben. That was really cool, really informative. It's always great to go beyond just talking about these things and being able to show how it works in the model, because I think the visuals really help to explain the differences, I think, much better than if you and I were just talking about it.
Yeah, yeah, and hopefully people were able to put up or be patient with me, kind of toggling between plans. But everybody who's used
Hey,
2D RAS modeling knows that
we've
exact
all
same
been there.
situation.
Yep,
So
we've all been there.
hopefully it was still informative. I know it was fun on our end, and yeah, looking forward to hearing more. And if and when we get the porosity stuff figured out, maybe we'll do a quick little follow-up video building on this and showing what the differences are with that. So Stan
Yeah.
Gibson, if you're listening, let us know how to use that porosity element, and we'll do an update to this. But all right, awesome. Well, if Chris, if you don't have anything else, I think we can close up for today. This has
All
been
right.
Full Momentum, an HEC-RAS podcast. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next month.
Bye, everybody.